Welcome to the Steel Curtain Podcast. It's Tuesday, September 3rd, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are 5 days away from their Week 1 matchup against the Atlanta Falcons at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I'm Josh Yourish, and today I'm going to be joined by my friend Danilo Castro of the Fansided Entertainment team to go through some of the biggest Steelers preseason headlines as we prepare for the regular season. But first, it's time for my official prediction and a bit of a look ahead to Sunday, because it's week 1 of the NFL season. We have football coming up for real, games that matter. And in those games that matter, it looks like it's going to be Spencer Anderson starting at left guard for Isaac Seumalo, who has been rolled out of week 1 for the Steelers. And that's kind of the biggest news coming out of this week leading up to the first game of the season. Seumalo averted disaster with his pectoral injury. It does not look to be a season-ending or a very long-term thing, but it will be Spencer Anderson starting at left guard. Broderick Jones on the official Steelers depth chart that was released today. We've talked about Broderick Jones all preseason. He's listed as the starting right tackle, but Mike Tomlin says there has been no decision about what side Jones will play on Sunday. And that mostly hinges on the health of Troy Fautanu. If Fautanu is healthy enough to go, he will be your starting right tackle. Broderick Jones might be your starting left tackle in that case, or it could be Dan Moore Jr. It looks more and more likely every day that passes that Dan Moore Jr. is going to be the week 1 starting left tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I almost cannot believe it, considering the fact that this team invested in left tackle or in starting tackles. Well, yeah, left tackles in back-to-back first rounds of the NFL draft, and it's still going to be Dan Moore Jr. Can't get rid of him. And that's a big concern for me. That's really the biggest news. We know what this team's going to look like. So, okay, it's time for an official record prediction from me. And before we do that, let's just take a look at the start of the schedule, because it starts off pretty soft. At Atlanta, okay, the Falcons might be an NFC contender. Kirk Cousins is also coming off of an Achilles injury. Don't know what you're going to get from him. A new head coach in Raheem Morris. Who knows what that's going to look like, but it's not an incredibly difficult week 1 opponent. It's a winnable game. Then at Denver in week 2, week 3, the Chargers come to Acrisure Stadium in Pittsburgh, and then week 4 at Indianapolis. The Steelers have to get out of that at least 2-2 to have a shot of posting a winning record, because it's a nightmare down the stretch of the season. After that, it's Dallas, Las Vegas, at Las Vegas, New York, and New York again, both at home. Bye week at Washington, then home to Baltimore, at Cleveland, at Cincinnati, home to Cleveland, at Philly, and then on a short week, Saturday game at Baltimore, even shorter week, Wednesday, Christmas Day game, home to Kansas City, and then finishing out the season, home to Cincinnati. It's a gauntlet in the back half, and that's why my official Steelers prediction for the 2024 season, I'll just give it to you right now, and then we'll talk about it. A big shock. The Steelers go 9-8. The Steelers have seemed to perpetually be about a 9-8 team in the recent years. Considering the quarterback situation that Mike Tomlin has had to deal with, you could say that's pretty impressive, right? It's been washed up Big Ben post-elbow injury. It's been Kenny Pickett, who is not an NFL quarterback. It's been Mitch Trubisky. Been even Mason Rudolph, and he's been able to scratch to 9-10 win seasons, even some better seasons than that. But it feels like 9 wins is the Steelers' destiny, especially with an incredibly difficult schedule. And we spent all offseason, I mean, I'm picking a winning record, but that's obviously not an optimistic view on the Steelers. We spent all offseason talking about how good this roster is around the 2 dart throws they have at quarterback. And I'm happy with how they're operating at the quarterback position. That doesn't mean Russell Wilson and Justin Fields are good players. Those are two separate things. And now all of a sudden, because of mismanagement with Broderick Jones, because of an Isaac Seumalo injury, because of a Nate Herbig injury and a Troy Fautanu injury and a lot of injuries to the depth of the offensive line, suddenly that group goes from a possible strength and a possible very meaningful strength for their offense to almost certainly a weakness. And that has just dampened any optimism I had about the season. And if that's the case, that offensive line injuries can do that to an optimistic offseason, then your team's probably not that good to begin with. And maybe it's 10 wins if they trade for Brandon Ayuk. But that just doesn't move the needle for me because I do not see this team winning a playoff game. I don't even see them making the playoffs at 9-8. I think it'll be really tough in their division. I think the Steelers probably finish third in the division. Cleveland probably behind them because that's what Cleveland does. And Deshaun Watson is for sure a disaster. Justin Fields and Russell Wilson are maybe a disaster. 9-8, I don't think it gets them into the playoffs. I think they just miss out. They're playing meaningful games the whole way down the stretch, and yet it feels disgusting because they're just scratching and clawing their way to it. And in this case, a lot of their wins have to come early in the season because of that gauntlet of a schedule that we talked about. Looking at week one, obviously, I mentioned it's Cousins coming off that Achilles injury. I expect a low-scoring game on Sunday, but with the banged-up Jaylen Warren, that potentially takes away half of your running game, which is really your strength, and an Isaac Seumalo injury depletes that even more. So a shaky offensive line, relying almost maybe exclusively on Najee Harris, or at least a limited version of Jaylen Warren, if that's the case. Up against the Falcons defense that, while it's not very good, it's much improved with the late preseason signings or trade for Matthew Judon and signing of Justin Simmons. This defense also has AJ Terrell at corner, who's a really good cover corner, who will not shut down George Pickens, but can slow down George Pickens. And I think ultimately the Steelers lose in week one. And that's not a good feeling when the schedule is soft at the beginning of the year to get off to a slow start like that. I think they do start 2-2. I think you're for sure beating Denver, but you're probably splitting with the Chargers and the Colts. And those aren't two great teams, but both of those teams, in my opinion, have better quarterbacks than the Steelers do. Even Anthony Richardson in Indianapolis, and we've only seen 4 games of him, he's just more dynamic. If the Steelers go to Justin Fields, then it's probably a wash. But I think Russell Wilson will be outmatched in that one because at least Anthony Richardson, with his legs, has something that can scare a defense. The Steelers don't have that when Russell Wilson is playing quarterback, and that is a big concern to me. The roster is still good. The Steelers roster is still good. But I don't know that it's good enough to carry an offense that has poor quarterback play and a bad offensive line. I think it could withstand one of those two things. I think it could withstand average, washed up Russell Wilson quarterback play and possibly make the playoffs if the offensive line was very good, was good to very good. I no longer have any faith in that. I said in the offseason that maybe this could be, if not this year, maybe next year, possibly the best offensive line in the NFL. When you have 2 first-round stalwarts at tackle, Broderick Jones, Troy Fautanu, left and right. You have veteran guards, Seumalo and Daniels, and then you have an emerging young rookie center in Zach Frazier who looks super reliable. They still have Frazier. They have one of the 2 guards, and who the hell knows what we're getting from either of the tackles because Fautanu's been hurt and Broderick Jones has been playing 2 positions the whole offseason. So maybe it's too harsh to tie that much of my prediction to the offensive line because I think this defense will be good. I worry about slot corner. It's been a worry all offseason. I don't think it's a make or break worry. I think they have enough talent at safety and at linebacker to cover up some of the flaws, to let Beanie Bishop go through some growing pains, if that's who you go with, to move maybe Dante Jackson inside with Corey Trace outside or something. I think you can weather those storms because there's enough talent on that side of the ball. I think their pass rush is going to be great. But if you look on offense, you have a poor offensive line, and now you probably only have a clear quarterback advantage in 3 games. The Broncos, Bo Nix, a rookie who I don't believe in. The Raiders, Gardner Minshew, and I don't even feel certain that Russell Wilson's better than Gardner Minshew, but I'll give it to the Steelers. And the Giants and Daniel Jones. And Daniel Jones won a playoff game 2 years ago. More recently than the Steelers and more recently than Russell Wilson. So maybe it's not even a huge advantage, if one at all, in those games. There are 0 games where I feel good about the Steelers' advantage at quarterback, other than maybe against the Browns and Deshaun Watson. But if Deshaun Watson plays his best, it's better than what you know you're going to get out of if he returns to that form. I just don't think it's going to happen. But that's still probably a wash. If Jaden Daniels doesn't turn out to be the quarterback that Washington thought they were drafting at number 2 overall, okay, maybe you have an advantage there. But at least, like the Anthony Richardson matchup, at least Jaden Daniels with his legs and his deep ball as well, but especially with his legs, has something that scares you. Russell Wilson does not scare NFL defenses. Justin Fields might. I think there's a chance Justin Fields starts by probably week 8. I think that ties into my prediction as well. But this is another mediocre season without an answer at quarterback, and you weren't going to have that. I like the way they operated at quarterback. 2 low-risk options. I'm fine with it. But this defense is still getting older. And the window to really compete with this defense, with TJ Watt, with Cam Hayward, with Minkah Fitzpatrick, is going to close soon. If you can't get the offensive line and the rest of the offense figured out, it's going to be another season like this. And it's because the Steelers operate in a win now mindset all the time, and you can't do that in the NFL. Look at the New Orleans Saints. They've been kicking the can down the road with the cap for years and years and years since Sean Payton and Drew Brees era. Those guys are long gone, and that's still a mediocre team down there. The Steelers don't do it as aggressively with the salary cap, but they operate on the same principle. You try to win every year. And unless you have an elite quarterback, you can't win every year in the NFL. And that's worrisome for me because I feel like by maybe the end of the season, this could feel a bit directionless. But at least there's the fail-safe with going to a backup quarterback. At least there's a chance to draft a quarterback or sign a quarterback in the offseason, and you still have the flexibility to do it. So I'm glad we're not tied into a $30 million a year wide receiver in Brandon Ayuk, and we'll get to that with my friend Danilo Castro when I bring him on. But with this win now mindset, the Steelers are going to go 9-8 again. And Mike Tomlin, and with his desperation and the organization's desperation to keep his meaningless streak of a winning season never having a losing season, because it's not even a winning season every year, it's turned him into the NFL's new Jeff Fisher. That's not a good place to be. 9 wins is the standard in Pittsburgh, and it's going to get real tiresome again after this season. At least the Steelers aren't tied into their quarterbacks for a long time. That's the one silver lining for me. But I went from very optimistic all offseason, and the way they've managed this offensive line has torpedoed that for me. So you might notice a trend continuing throughout this show. I'm no longer as high on the Steelers as I was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago. And I'm not feeling as good about the 2024 season as I was. If you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers, I have an announcement for you. And if you're watching this show, I'm sure you are. And if you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers, you may not be happy with me and my prediction right now. But if you would like to support the Steel Curtain Podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube. We really appreciate your support. And with that, it's time to bring on my friend, Danilo Castro. Now it's time for me to welcome on my good friend Danilo Castro from Fansided Entertainment Team for a little thing I'm calling Steelers preseason headlines. We're hopefully going to do multiple of these throughout the season, and I'm bringing Danilo on because he's somebody who's a really great question asker, and I think somebody who's going to get some good answers out of me because we're kind of flipping the tables. Danilo's going to come with his 5 biggest Steelers preseason headlines, present them to me. I'll give him my take. He'll ask some follow-ups, and we'll go back and forth on those topics. With an off week right now, before the Steelers kick things off, we're heading into the first week of the season. Felt like a great opportunity to throw around some of these topics, bat them around, and get ready for the start of the season. So welcome to the pod, Danilo.
Thank you. It's good to be here. For everybody listening and for you, I just want to clarify up front, not an expert by any means. So these questions are going to be sincere and some of them might be dumb, but I'm curious to get your answers, obviously. And I think some good conversation will come out of them regardless,
Yeah, of course. That's kind of the premise here. Danilo's presenting what he sees as the interesting points as something of an outsider, because I think we get our heads too buried in the sand sometimes just following the Steelers and get very granular. So we're zooming out a little bit with this and we're going to see how it goes. So ready with your first one whenever you are, Danilo.
Okay. Well, the big one seems to be Brandon Ayuk. That's the one I keep seeing. That's the one that keeps popping up on my feeds. I read that the Steelers they didn't want to break the bank with him, and they didn't want to go past what they were paying TJ Watt. So they offered a little bit under that. Do you feel like that was a good call ultimately? Like, I know there's been lots of speculation about what could have been, how that could have, altered their team. Are you happy with that? Like, are you a glass half full or a half empty guy with regards to that choice?
So with Ayuk, it felt like the Steelers potentially, if they were able to pry him away from San Francisco, it felt like the reports I was reading as well were that they weren't going to go for that $30 million a year number that Ayuk ultimately did get from the 49ers.
Yeah.
If they make the trade, I wouldn't have cared. If they had made the trade, I wouldn't have cared what the number was. Because you have him, you have to sign him. That's kind of part and parcel. Like, if you make that deal, you have to do it. For me, I'm glad they didn't make the trade. It leaves them very vulnerable at wide receiver too. But the reason I'm excited, or not excited, because you're never excited when a team doesn't do something. That's where you are. I think the Steelers are they're a very middling team. A middling team without an answer at quarterback. So I don't see a reason to invest resources, even though the reports are if the 49ers accepted the deal, it wasn't going to be for a first-round pick. I don't see where that moves the needle for this team. And it kind of goes into ultimately what my operating principle is for this year and how I'm thinking about this year. The Steelers continually exist in a win-now mode. And that comes from Mike Tomlin. I think it comes from the Rooneys at ownership levels.
Yeah.
And they're just not a team that should be operating that way because they don't have a quarterback. So if you continue to try to win 9-10 games every year, then you're never going to get your answer at quarterback. And we've learned that by trying to draft Kenny Pickett with the 20th pick in the first round, because that's just not really where you get quarterbacks. So for me, it's kind of irrelevant, because if they trade for Ayuk, okay, you have another really good receiver. You win 10 games instead of 9, 10 instead of 8, maybe you win 11. This team's not winning a playoff game without a quarterback. And I don't think they have a playoff winning quarterback on the roster. I like Fields better than Russell Wilson.
Yeah.
But for me, it just doesn't move the needle in a meaningful enough way. So I'm glad they passed. I wish the Steelers would have maybe done something else at wide receiver 2, but I'm
Okay.
glad they passed on Ayuk.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, like you said, if it's going to make that minor of a difference, it's like a more exciting in the moment trade than
Yes.
an overall like impact maker.
Yeah, I feel like people get very caught up in the idea of like our team will be better right now.
Yeah.
With Ayuk, and that's true.
But marginally.
To what meaningful end are they going to be better?
Yeah.
I just don't understand how much adding a player like Ayuk, even if you think so with somebody like Ayuk, I think of him as a upper tier wide receiver, maybe like 10 to 15th best in the league, which is really good and probably better than George Pickens.
Yeah.
But even if you think of him as a top 10 or a top 5 wide receiver, what does that do for this team that does not have a quarterback? You're still searching for the most important answer. So let's put the pieces together after we address that. Otherwise, we're just existing in this win now mode when we can't ultimately win the most important thing now.
That makes sense to me. So ultimately a positive. You think bigger picture positive?
Bigger picture positive. It stings the fan base right now to not get Ayuk, but I'm going to say it's a bigger picture positive in this sense.
Okay, cool. On the topic of trades.
Yeah.
That I've been reading that the Steelers are looking to make a trade with regards to running back, and that two guys who are going to be free agents after this season, Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, that there may be some trade talks with regards to at least one of them. If that is the case, being that those guys are obviously, pretty essential pieces, are you more willing to see one of those guys go over the other? Do you not want to see either of those things happen? I mean,
so the Steelers are facing a weird situation with running back where, obviously Najee Harris was a first round pick.
Yeah.
Jaylen Warren was an undrafted player. They're both facing a contract year. The Steelers didn't pick up the 5th year option on Najee Harris. For me, it's Warren. It's always been Warren. He's the better player. You keep Warren around no matter what. I don't think there's any chance either of them get moved this year unless there's a disastrous situation at the beginning of the year and things are just not working out for the team as a whole. And you're heading into the back half of the season, approaching the trade deadline, and you don't feel comfortable where this roster is at, then okay, you can start moving pieces, but a running back's just not going to net you very much, especially one that would be a rental at that point.
Okay.
On the question of Warren or Najee, because Jaylen Warren was banged up in preseason, it looks like he's going to be fully healthy heading into week 1 in Atlanta. I feel like he's a better fit in the Arthur Smith offense than Najee Harris is, given his ability to get to the edges. This running game wants to go outside a lot more than right up the middle, which Najee Harris is best at.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see a world in which Harris is effective enough in this offense to justify giving him more touches than Jaylen Warren. Last year, it was like a 50-50 split.
Okay.
And I don't see a world in which it makes sense to continually feed Najee Harris, even though he's the guy you initially invested in with a first-round pick.
Yeah, he was definitely the name I heard the most peripherally, but I wasn't aware of like that split. So it's kind of surprising to me, but it makes sense the way you break it down. Yeah.
And in terms of movement, because that brings up like a bigger point to me. If this team, I talked about them operating on like a win now principle all the time. If this team's heading into the trade deadline, the front half of the schedule is easier than the second half.
Okay.
And it's so interesting that you bring this up because like this is so forward looking. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good way to like start to approach the season, because if this team's in a point where approaching the trade deadline, it doesn't look pretty.
Yeah.
You obviously have the fail-safe of switching the quarterback from benching Russell Wilson and going to Justin Fields. But do you start to move on from some of the even better players? Like, not just talking Najee Harris. At what point, if this goes poorly, do you start to consider maybe eventually we have to move on from a 30-year-old TJ Watt or a Minkah Fitzpatrick, who are the key stalwarts of your defense, because you have so much money invested in that side of the football? And if this isn't looking like a team that can win a playoff game, then like, what are we doing? So do you start to look even further into the future?
Yeah.
And move a bigger piece? That's what's more interesting to me than necessarily the running back movement.
How realistic do you think it, like, how high is your concern level that it will get to like that fire sale point where we're just having to shuffle things to see what's going to happen? Like, is that a legitimate concern, or is that like, that's a possibility kind of deal?
So it's hard to, I'm trying to keep a couple of things square in my mind.
Okay.
Because I think the Steelers quarterback situation is one of the worst in the NFL.
Okay. I do have questions pertaining to that. So we'll discuss that in a second.
So I think it's one of the worst in the NFL with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields.
Yeah.
I also think it is a significant upgrade from Kenny Pickett last year. Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph, Mitch Trubisky.
Mm-hmm.
Because that situation was even more dire, even more disastrous. So I like the roster.
Okay.
I like the Steelers defense. The Steelers upgraded at offensive coordinator with Arthur Smith. They're better than they were with Matt Canada. At quarterback, they're better. Whether I like Russell Wilson or not, they're better than they were with Kenny Pickett.
Yeah.
On defense, they're pretty much the same. Cam Hayward is healthy now, so we'll say that stays pat. Adding Patrick Queen to that mix at linebacker, that's an upgrade. So I just named 3 places where they're either the same or better.
Or yeah.
The offensive line should probably be better. They drafted a first-round tackle again. So there's so many reasons that I should be feeling optimistic about this season. Yes. And as we get closer and closer to it, I'm feeling more and more pessimistic about like the overarching, not just this year, because I think ultimately this team can win 10 games. Maybe if everything breaks right, it could win 11 games.
Yeah.
And that gets you into the playoffs. Winning 10 games probably gets you into the playoffs. I don't see a world in which this team can win a playoff game on even footing. If the other team's quarterback is out, something bizarre.
Yeah.
Obviously anyone can win a playoff game. I can't see this team going far in the playoffs in a serious contender way. So in that sense, you should be looking to the future. You should be looking to, what do we do with the TJ Watt?
Yeah.
What do we do with some of our aging great players on defense? Because if we're not getting a quarterback right now, if neither of the guys on the roster are the answer right now, maybe we draft one next year. He's not going to be good enough to contend to win a playoff game as a rookie. No. That's 2 more seasons. His second season, maybe, if he's the guy even, what if you miss again? Then you're looking at TJ Watt heading into like his age 33 season, looking for another contract extension that'll probably want $35 million a year. That's an uneasy situation with a defense that you took a really long time to rebuild. So I think it's a really fun question because there is a world in which this goes bad.
Sure.
Russell Wilson,
there always is.
Yes. There's a world in which Russell Wilson is bad.
Yes.
And then they have to go to Justin Fields and things are already too far gone to integrate him into a new offense when the second half of this schedule is insanely difficult. So I don't think it'll get bad enough to answer your question finally.
Yeah, to
loop
get
back
to that
around.
level that you were talking about.
I don't think it's very realistic that it could get to the level of trade deadline. We're looking at really shipping out meaningful pieces. That's also not the way the Steelers typically operate.
Okay. All right.
But I do see a world in which the back half of the season, they go into week 10-ish at about 500, and the back half of the season goes really poorly. And then you have to evaluate after next year. So I think that's a good question because we tend to be optimistic. We fall in love, like you fall in love with your own players on your own team that you root for. And you're like, well, this guy's really good.
Yeah,
this guy's really good.
Out.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think zooming out to be like, there are people writing about the Steelers maybe should move on from Najee Harris if they're not going to give him a contract extension. And because you're not making up these headlines, we should add, you're finding these headlines, of course. and then to spin it forward, what if it goes south?
Yes.
What does that look like? I'm not so sure what it does look like. I'm not so sure how realistic it is, but it is a possibility.
Sure.
Given how disastrous I think the quarterback situation could be, even though it's an upgrade. So I'm trying to square so many things when I answer that question.
There's a lot. Yeah, it's moving.
Yeah,
pieces.
But I like the question a lot because we rarely consider what if this goes poorly.
Yeah,
and I am the type of person that is like, if you can't win a Super Bowl, what is the point?
No, yeah, you're right. You can't keep winning now if you're not winning the ultimate. Like the aspirations, like win the Super Bowl is it.
Yes, that's the whole point of the entire thing.
Yeah.
And the Steelers haven't won a playoff game since 2016, which like people don't think about.
Yeah.
And everyone praises Mike Tomlin for continually winning. Okay. What has it done?
It's like winning up to a point. There hasn't been a
parade in a really long time.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the whole point. So I am, if it is going south, I'm open to like, we have to move on from key pieces.
Yeah.
Even though I like the roster a lot heading into the year.
Okay.
So, Number three,
it is a pivot. It's less, I think, big picture, more severe. It's more like what's coming up. Spencer Anderson is slated to fill in at, I believe, left guard for the first month or so of the season.
Yeah.
Everything I've read about him seemed big versatility guy. There. You just is that this? So I'm a novice, obviously. I don't watch football like that. Is that a benefit? Like, are you excited about him fulfilling a role, or does it like with baseball? Obviously, being a utility guy has a certain connotation. Is that the case here? Like, is this going to benefit him? Is he going to continue to start games? Do you think once who he's filling in for comes back? Like, I mean, are you excited about him in particular?
Not necessarily. So it is valuable to have versatility on the offensive line as a depth piece, like Anderson does. And obviously he'll be filling in for Seyomalu, who suffered an injury in the final preseason game. Or I believe maybe right after it, but in preseason, obviously. And the versatility is valuable when you're a backup like that, because it's almost necessary.
Okay.
Because you can't guarantee like, oh, I'm just a left guard. The left guard gets hurt. I'm your man.
Got you.
Maybe the right guard gets hurt. Maybe the center gets hurt. Maybe the right tackle. And he is somebody who can play across the line somewhat credibly from what we've seen in preseason. I'm not necessarily excited about it because the Steelers drafted a guy, Mason McCormick, in the 4th round this year.
Yeah. And
it felt like he's the more exciting pick to fill in at guard, considering the injury situation.
Got you.
And they don't want to go to him just yet. He's somebody who's pretty raw. So that's understandable. Like, you don't want to throw a developmental piece out there and have him get slaughtered early in the season when you have a guy who's a bit more proven.
Yeah.
It's valuable. It's also a problem that the Steelers are undergoing on the rest of the offensive line. Like I like that this question is very specific, but it is also bigger.
Okay,
so
perfect.
The Steelers have spent the entire preseason moving Broderick Jones, who was drafted to be the future left tackle, playing him at right tackle. And that may not seem like a big thing, but he's struggled a lot at right tackle. He played 11 games there last year. He's struggled a lot there because offensive linemen talk about it a lot. Like, there are some, I don't even know who specifically has said this, but who compared it to like wiping with the other hand, right? Like it's something that you're so used to doing, and now you have to completely flip it, you know? And Jones has really struggled with that. An elbow injury has been part of it as well. And now it looks like he's going to start the season on the bench.
Okay.
Who was a first-round pick a year ago. Troy Fautanu looks healthy enough to start at right tackle, and that's where they want Fautanu to be, at right tackle.
Okay.
And that means Dan Moore Jr., who I believe and have said is the worst left tackle in the NFL and who gave up the most pressures in the NFL last year at left tackle, will be back at left tackle to start the season. And it is a funny question, this question of versatility on the offensive line, because the Steelers seem to believe in it a ton, and it has not worked out for them. So I mentioned Mason McCormick.
Yeah.
And he is a mid-round pick at right guard. And they've been playing him at right guard in the preseason. That's where he belongs. Kevin Dotson, they drafted a few years ago at right guard and almost exclusively played him at left guard in all of the reps that he got. And he struggled a lot. And then they traded him to the Rams for a 5th or 6th round pick in the preseason because he lost his job at left guard to Isaac Seumalo when they signed him, who's now injured. And Dotson was excellent playing for the Rams, playing at right guard.
Okay.
His position. So offensive linemen, like sometimes we don't think of them as having specific positions.
Yeah.
They do.
Okay.
Like there are spots that these guys feel way more comfortable than other spots. I think with Seumalo potentially being out, and I don't know the severity of how long this is going to be with Seumalo missing time, but with him potentially missing time, with Troy Fautanu being injured in the preseason, I worry about the offensive line, which is something I thought was going to be a strength, being a weakness again for this team. And that's where I start to get into my concerns about maybe this is not going to go as well as I was feeling earlier in the season. Because when you're a team that invests very heavily in a certain thing, and then that thing doesn't get better,
you didn't
where
invest
does that
in the other,
where does that leave you?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like you mentioned baseball. I know you're a huge baseball fan.
Yeah.
If your pitching staff is really bad, your starting pitching staff is very bad. You spend a whole offseason. Drafting isn't the same in the MLB, obviously.
No,
but you bring up a high prospect. You sign 2 guys over a couple year span, and you bring up another top prospect, and you draft another. Like you have these pieces that you have invested a lot of resources in.
You're putting eggs in that basket.
And it's shit. Where do you go from there?
In asking that initial question, I didn't realize there was that much of an emphasis on it. So that's okay. Dicey a little bit. I see your concern.
Yes, it is. It's one of my potential big concerns because now the left side of that line is going to be Dan Moore Jr., who I've said is the worst left tackle in the NFL.
Reiterate,
and Spencer Anderson. And then your center's a rookie, 2nd round pick, Zach Frazier, who I feel good about. But you're suddenly massively unproven on the left side of the offense.
That's not a lot of experience.
No.
So,
and that is a huge concern for me. That could have this offense off to a really slow start.
Yeah.
And the offense is already the thing to be worried about. So then if the Steelers don't start fast this year, which is like I'm going through some of my predictions, I'll give my record prediction today. If the Steelers do not start fast this year, they're not going to be a good team because the schedule in the second half is a nightmare.
Okay.
So this is another reason that they might not start fast. And it is lowering. I'm being more and more pessimistic on this episode, and I didn't know I'd get there. That's why this is interesting and fun to me to have somebody present me with questions and like hold me to the fire on certain things. I'm becoming more and more pessimistic about the offensive line and the offense as a whole. And maybe a Brandon Ayuk trade would have fixed that, but I don't think so.
I think your initial gut on the Ayuk thing is right. But that's an interesting point about the schedule playing a role in like whether there needs to be a fast start or not.
Yeah.
I feel like when I hear, again, peripherally, that those aren't the sort of like variables you hear, like we need to capitalize now when we have a weaker playing field or like more chance to win.
Yes.
So
yeah, and it's something that the Steelers don't typically do. This team in the past few years under Mike Tomlin has not gone off to hot starts.
Okay.
And that is something that I am becoming increasingly concerned about.
Okay. We'll leave it there for right now. I'm sure you'll revisit that topic.
Yeah.
My last two questions are Russell Wilson related.
Okay, fun.
One is a criticism that was thrown at him. Mark Schlereth said, I'm going to read the full quote. Russ isn't willing to admit he's not good at stuff. He's delusional, which is the headline. That's the bit you take for sure. If you're not willing to admit it, then you can't fix it. So pretty strong criticism. There's not a lot of like silver lining in that.
No.
Do you agree with that? We've danced around the topic of QB a little bit so far. Do you agree with that? If you don't, what is the problem with Russell Wilson?
I think it's pretty spot on.
Okay.
And Schlereth is somebody who played for the Broncos for a long time and is very plugged in Denver. So he would know the way Wilson was operating when he was there.
Yeah.
And Russell Wilson, when he was near the end in Seattle before he got traded, he was still a very mobile quarterback. And the thing about Wilson is he's like at his best, he was an offense unto himself because he did not exist within any bounds of a real offensive structure. It was pretty much either he's handing it off or he's going to run around back there and play backyard football and guys are going to get open. And he was athletic enough to do that.
Yeah.
And then when he got traded to Denver, Wilson bulked up about like, I don't remember specifically how much, but he bulked up. Significantly. And he wanted to become this late stage Drew Brees-esque pocket passer who's existing within structure and dicing a defense up, throwing over the middle of the field, things that he has never been good at and will not be good at. Not because like there's anything that he hasn't worked on enough. Maybe that's the case. He'll never be able to throw over the middle because he's 5'11", and this is the NFL. And that's something that he reckoned with some because he did slim down more last year. He was more mobile last year.
Okay.
He was better in the Sean Payton offense last year. But Sean Payton, who had late career Drew Brees, he had all career Drew Brees, but he also had late career Drew Brees, which is what Russell Wilson wanted the second act of his career to be. He said, I'll take an $80 million cap hit to get rid of you. And that's massive. That's the biggest in the history of the NFL. I agree with Schlereth. I think there are massive holes in Wilson's game.
Yeah.
And I think while he's healthy enough to play and throughout the preseason maintained that if there was a game, his calf injury that he suffered early on he suffered on the first day of training camp, would not have been enough to keep him out of a game.
Okay.
That may be true. It could be enough to limit his mobility to the point that he's like bulked up Russ again, who's not mobile enough to move around. And when you take that away from his game, he doesn't have enough to keep an offense on schedule. He doesn't exist within structure well enough to win big games. And I do think it's going to be a tough year for Russell Wilson. I think we see Justin Fields by probably week 8.
Really?
If not earlier.
Okay.
I think it's done for Russ. And I think Russ will be, which is the case with a lot of great athletes. Like he's potentially a Hall of Fame quarterback. I think Russ will be the last to know that it's over.
It's well put. We're going to cap it there. Again, Wilson related. This is a broader thing. You're obviously a Steelers fan before anything else, right? In this sort of setting. Now he's a Steelers captain.
Yeah.
Right. He's one of 4 Steelers captains, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
Are you excited about that? Does that make you happy? Do Steelers fans are is that like hell yeah, or is it like this is going to be bad? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what is the reaction to that, which should be like a big thing?
So, to me, I don't read anything into it necessarily.
Okay.
Because, and I'm actually glad you brought this up because this is not something I would have thought to bring up.
Cool.
If you're a starting NFL quarterback,
yes,
you're a team captain.
You should be team captain. Yeah.
Like that's well, not even that you should be. You pretty much are. I don't know.
Regardless.
We could look through pretty much all of the teams. I would wager at least 31, if not 32, of the week 1 starting quarterbacks on their team, other than maybe some rookies. But I know even Caleb Williams, rookie, has not played an NFL game yet, named a captain in Chicago. So pretty much rookies sometimes aren't. But if you're going into the year knowing you're going to be the starter, you're almost always a captain.
Okay.
And
so it's like an assumed thing. Okay.
It is kind of an assumed thing. It's interesting that we spent all of training camp being like, maybe there's a quarterback battle between Wilson and Fields, and there never was. And now it's like Wilson's a captain.
Yeah.
Okay, so why didn't you just tell us he was the starter from the start? Mike Tomlin kind of did. He said he had pole position. And it was more the national media that wanted to make it into a controversy.
Okay.
And it never was going to be. I do think that Russell Wilson is not a guy I would want to lead my football team. I'll tell you that much.
Okay.
I think if you asked his former teammates if he should be a captain on any team, they'd say no.
Okay.
Right. Even the Super Bowl teams in Seattle, before Russ was like early on, all those players, Richard Sherman, Doug Baldwin, like a lot of the former guys that he played with, especially that defense, do not like Russell Wilson and have openly said a lot of things about how they do not like Russell Wilson. I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm just pulling this off memory.
Sure.
But I'm almost certain that there's a story Richard Sherman has told about how, or maybe it was a different member of that Seattle defense, but I know it was someone there.
Yeah.
That said to contact Russ in like the off season, he didn't even have his phone number. He had to go through his agent.
Oh.
And that's the quarterback of your team.
Yeah.
And then when Wilson gets to Denver, there are all these stories about how he has his own office in the Denver building with the coaches, and he's not in the locker room. And this is a guy who has always wanted to be treated differently. And to me, that's not somebody that can be your leader.
Yes.
I think Mike Tomlin in the past has done a very good job managing mercurial personalities. That's just pretty much an indisputable fact at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, he had Antonio Brown, who's now running CTESPN, and kept him under wraps for a really long time and kept that team together. And Mike Tomlin's always had a thing about like, everyone doesn't get treated equally. They get treated fairly. Ben Roethlisberger definitely got preferential treatment from Mike Tomlin relative to the rest of the roster. He should.
Yeah.
Like he won the franchise 2 Super Bowls, guaranteed Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
Russell Wilson, I don't know the situation. I'm not there every day. I'm not one of those reporters that's there and has the inside knowledge. If Tomlin is giving that preferential treatment to Wilson, I have a problem with that. While he has proven it in the NFL, he hasn't proven it lately, and he sure as hell hasn't proven it here.
Yeah.
So that's something that is a concern for me. Not that he's a captain.
Sure. The title.
Yes. But that he's the one potentially steering the ship, at least on offense.
Yeah.
And that worries me because we don't have a lot of proof that guys want to row in the same direction as this guy. And that's what I've tried to talk about all offseason about. He's this corny character. And it's funny that you brought up the word delusional because, like, in some ways we've seen it. I mean, when this guy was hurt, he went through with nobody else on the field in front of the Sunday Night Football cameras, went through an entire like simulated game in his head with no football out on the field and was fake high-fiving his fake teammates who weren't there. That's a delusional person.
Yeah.
And in some ways, to succeed at quarterback in the NFL, you have to be delusional.
You have to have a little bit. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
I don't know. I'm quoting a lot of things that I remember, but I don't know the attribution.
Yeah.
But somebody said to be an NFL starting quarterback, you either have to believe in God or believe you are a God. And I think Russell Wilson certainly does both.
Yes.
But I don't know how that's going to work when he's clearly on the back nine of his career, maybe completely over the hill.
Yeah. So, okay, I think you answered both, like in the more practical sense of captain, which I was less aware of, and then the more like the thematic, like symbolic, what that means for it. So
yeah,
both make sense.
Yeah,
and good and bad.
So you're obviously a movie guy first and foremost. You're a baseball fan. You're a movie guy.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of like an actor comp for Russell Wilson.
Okay.
And like maybe it's a John Travolta, but I definitely don't think Pittsburgh's going to be his Pulp Fiction. Like
he wants it to be.
Yes, he wants
it will be.
He wants it to be his Pulp Fiction. I don't know all of the. I'm not as granular as you. I don't know.
No,
that's all the flops in between.
Yes,
a Grease and a Pulp Fiction.
Yes,
he wants this to be his Pulp Fiction, and I don't think that happens very often. Like I'm certain you could name more actors that it didn't come back for than it did.
But like, it's hard to
remember guys like that.
Huh?
We remember guys like that. And they're pretty much the exception that proves the rule.
Yes. And it never lasts, No. Travolta went back to making bad movies eventually. It's just like and like you just said, that's best case scenario.
Yeah.
Most times it's not going to work. And especially if you're not willing to I don't know, be realistic with yourself.
Yeah. Because a lot of times those comeback stories that you hear about in Hollywood stuff, the actor took like no money to be in this movie because they wanted to, and Russell Wilson took no money to come to Pittsburgh, but it's because he's getting $80 million from Denver and like kind of couldn't make any more than that. Anything he made from the Steelers takes out of that dead money that he's getting from the Broncos. So like not really the same situation, but kind of, there's some parallels. But you hear like they really wanted to work for this one director and they were willing to actually audition for it.
Like Quentin Tarantino sat Travolta down and he's like, you've been picking shit for 15 years. Like, this is what you're good at. Do this for me.
Mm-hmm.
And John Travolta had to be like, okay, yeah, you're right. I need to stop doing what I'm doing because it's not working. But that requires a certain level of like looking in the mirror and being honest with yourself and being like, okay, it's not working. You have to get there first. Getting there might be tricky with Wilson based on what you're telling me,
Yeah, and maybe that's what getting cut by Denver was. Maybe was a massive plate of humble pie and whatever.
True.
But if you're comparing like the director thing, he's now here with Arthur Smith, who couldn't hack it as an NFL head coach. And I do like some of the things he's done as an offensive coordinator.
Yeah.
But his last year in Denver, he had Sean Payton, who is like one of the best offensive minds of maybe this century.
Okay.
in the NFL. Like I think Sean Payton is in some ways overrated as a head coach. He is definitely a great offensive mind.
Gotcha.
And he said, no, thank you.
Okay.
And that's concerning.
That's damning. Yeah. That's a little, yeah.
So I didn't know that this episode was going to be so pessimistic, but apparently somebody needed to get these thoughts out of me. And that's why I wanted you to come on, because I didn't know where we were going to go.
Yeah.
I wasn't prepped for any of this. And I think it turned out really well. These are some opinions that I haven't gotten out because I haven't been asked the question. So I'm glad you came on. I think it worked out really well. And thanks for doing it.
Yeah, of course. It was a lot of fun. I'm sure you'll balance it up. Throw a little bit more optimism, maybe elsewhere in the episode.
Yeah.
It'll all even out.
I'm going to do some predictions at the top of it. So hopefully that might be worse because people will go up the roller coaster and come crashing down right here.
Well, it's a roller coaster.
And then they don't even know where they're going to end up because they're going to finish the episode with some John Travolta, Quentin Tarantino references and not know what hit them. But I think it was great. And I appreciate your insights as an outsider. It gets me out of my head a little bit, and it was really helpful.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks I feel like I have a better grasp. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course. Let's do it again.
Will do.
Fantastic stuff from Danilo Castro. It was a really fun exercise to do that. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. The Steelers season is coming up. It's right around the corner. Next time that we talk, next Monday, we'll have an actual game to break down. We'll have real reactions from a meaningful Steelers football game. Right now, the Steelers are 3-point favorites, I believe. Let me double check that. 3-point underdogs. My apologies. The Steelers are 3-point underdogs right now. Heading into Atlanta, I'd probably just take the under if I'm a better in that situation. I don't think either of these offenses are going to be functioning particularly well right off the jump. So just a couple of bets to leave you with. I take the under there, and I didn't like what I saw from Russell Wilson in the preseason, especially from a mobility standpoint. So if you're looking for a player prop, Russell Wilson under 16.5 rushing yards, which you can get at a couple different sports books. That looks pretty good to me. I think we're going to see a statuesque version of Russell Wilson early in the season. I don't know that it's going to be all that effective for the Steelers offense. It certainly won't be effective for Russell Wilson's rushing totals. I think you see those come down into the single digits by week 4, week 5, after some games with pretty limited mobility. So I would take the under there, and I would take the under in the game with the Steelers entering as 3-point underdogs, and the total right now sitting at about 41.5 or 42.5. It's a low number. It doesn't really scare me because of the Steelers' offensive line problems and how good their defense could be. We'll be back to break it all down next Monday at 1:30, back to our normal time because we don't have a holiday weekend interfering with things. We'll be back to our normal time, and I hope you'll be back with us. Till then, have a good week and go Steelers.